welcome back. So today I'll be looking at and giving you my thoughts on a very popular TED Talk from Dr. Anil Seth called Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality. A good friend of mine, Matthew, from the channel Consciousness Matters, did a review himself on this TED Talk, which I've linked in the description, so do be sure to go over and have a look at his. So, without further ado, let's have a look at the TED Talk Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality with Dr. Anil Seth.
So just over a year ago, for the third time in my life, I ceased to exist. I was having
That's already an interesting claim.
a small operation. My brain was filling with anesthetic. And I remember a sense of detachment and falling apart and coldness. And then I was back, drowsy and disoriented, but definitely there. Now, when you wake from a deep sleep, you might
Okay, I see what he means.
feel confused about the time or anxious about oversleeping, but there's always a basic sense of time having passed, of a continuity between then and now. And coming around from anesthesia is very different. I could have been under for 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 years, or even 50 years. I simply wasn't there. It was total oblivion.
Again, this then raises the question of the difference in experience between not having an experience versus having no memory of an experience. Experientially exactly the same, but difficult, of course, to know for sure which was the case. Under general anaesthesia is very much, in a sense, like deep sleep or coma states, etc., in the sense that there is no memory at all of experience. We can't say for sure that there was no experience because, as I say, there's no real way to know the difference outside of, if you've got no memory of having an experience, is the same experientially as not having an experience. So how would you know which is true? But as I say, with deep sleep and comatose and as well, deep states of meditation, the passage of time seems to stop completely. It seems as if, and I've never been under general anesthesia, but I have certainly been under deep sleep, of course. And as he quite rightly says, the time can be however long it can be, and it will feel like an instant between experiential states. I've fainted before, which is the whole kind of the cause, or at least the trigger for my anxiety disorder, and it was really just one sensation of feeling absolutely crap to opening my eyes and wondering what the hell has just happened and am I in a dream. There was no experience of blankness in between there. It was just one experience to the next, and as he rightly says, any amount of time could have passed, you wouldn't know any different. So that's I understand that.
Within each of our brains, the combined activity of many billions of neurons, each one a tiny biological machine, is generating a conscious experience. And
there's an assumption immediately. Wrong question. It shouldn't be initially, we've got this brain with the neural connections, and then immediately jump to the question of, well, how does this happen? How does this generate consciousness? The first question is the basic one. Does it cause consciousness? Is that what consciousness comes from? Because there are multiple, other potential explanations that work equally well to the correlations that we see. So that's the whole question.
not just any conscious experience, your conscious experience right here and right now. How does this happen? Answering this question is so important because consciousness for each of us is all there is. Without it, there's no world, there's no self, there's nothing at all.
Consciousness is the sky in which the clouds take place. Without the sky, without pure consciousness, there would be no suffering, no identity, no interpretations, nothing, because the sky is what is necessary for the clouds to exist within them. Without the sky, there is no clouds. So without consciousness, there is no experience of anything.
We can experience joy and suffering. What about other animals? Might they be conscious too? Do they also have a sense of self? And as computers get faster and smarter, maybe there'll come a point, maybe not too far away, when my iPhone develops a sense of its own existence. Now,
That's difficult to say either way because it depends exactly what the mechanism of consciousness is, and we've already assumed in this video that it is as a generated phenomena of the brain. So in which case, then maybe if a computer system can, or an AI, whatever, can get to a reasonable complexity, then maybe it can generate it. I would argue that, well, maybe if it gets to a certain level of complexity, then maybe that will allow consciousness to work through it, not necessarily to be generated from it. But again, it's difficult because we've already laid down the assumption. I mean, I don't know much about Anil Seth. I know he's a very strong researcher in consciousness, so he probably has a lot more context than I do. But again, considering that consciousness is the biggest question, really, in terms of what it is, where it comes from, that immediate assumption does make me nervous.
I actually think the prospects for a conscious AI are pretty remote. And I think this because my research is telling me that consciousness has less to do with pure intelligence and more to do with our nature as living and breathing organisms. Consciousness and intelligence are very different things. You don't have to be smart to suffer, but you probably...
Intelligence is a part of the content of consciousness, which is certainly dependent on the structures of our brains, at least to some degree, because of course, you can damage the brain or change the brain in any way and affect intelligence in a certain area. But what doesn't change is that baseline consciousness, that sense of self.
Probably do have to be alive. In the story I'm going to tell you, our conscious experiences of the world around us and of ourselves within it are kinds of controlled hallucinations.
Just to explain, I think, what he means by the fact that we're hallucinating reality, I agree with that. We're hallucinating the version of reality that we understand it to be. We're not seeing reality as it actually is. We're only seeing reality as far as our physical bodies are able to interpret the sense stimuli that we're designed to kind of to interpret. So our sights, our smells, our sounds, etc., all that kind of thing, all generates together only as far as the brain allows us to generate the world that we see. It's not reality as it is, it's reality as far as the human body can interpret it.
People even say it's beyond the reach of science altogether. But in fact, the last 25 years have seen an explosion of scientific work in this area. If you come to my lab at the University of Sussex, you'll find scientists from all different disciplines, and sometimes even philosophers, all of us together trying to understand how consciousness happens and what happens when it goes wrong. And the strategy is very simple. I'd like you to...
But that's difficult if you're already taking this research, under a framework that we know already that the brain is doing it. It's just how is it doing it? Because then any other possibilities to explain the correlations that we see are off the table, and you'll never find them. So one must be open to understanding where that philosophy has its limits, especially with phenomena that we see with veridical perception in near-death experiences, evidential mediumship, information reception, all that kind of stuff, remote viewing, whatever else, that suggests that perhaps there is more to it than just, which is already a very complicated question, that the brain is producing it. So if you already operate with that and do your research with that assumption, you're looking already for something that can't be answered.
Think about consciousness in the way that we've come to think about life. Now, at one time, people thought the property of being alive could not be explained by physics and chemistry, that life had to be more than just mechanism. But people no longer think that, as biologists got on with the job of explaining the properties of living systems.
Talking about how the body, supports itself and how matter turns into living matter. The question is that body then generating life or supporting life? To me, that's kind of the question. Then it comes to consciousness, and it's the same question. Is the body producing consciousness to however many varying degrees of sentience, depending on the different species, or is it allowing consciousness to experience itself more fully through more and more complex bodies that are certainly, mechanistically determined through, I believe, the process of evolution, etc.
The basic mystery of what life is started to fade away, and people didn't propose any more magical solutions like a force of life or an élan vital. So as with life, so with consciousness. Once we start explaining its properties in terms of things happening inside brains and bodies, the apparently insoluble mystery of what consciousness is...
Let me just listen to that back again.
Once we start explaining its properties in terms of things happening inside brains and bodies, the apparently insoluble mystery of what consciousness is should start to fade away.
Not necessarily, because again, we're dealing with correlation. We're not dealing with, clear causatory mechanisms here. We haven't found those yet. We might do, but as of now, it's not right, I don't think, to say that the evidence we have is totally only leaning toward a materialistic brain generates mind hypothesis or theory, when there are other theories or other hypotheses that that predict those correlations just as well. So I don't think that just naming the correlations of mind and brain is enough to fade the mystery out entirely, because we still don't have that mechanism either way as to how either the brain generates consciousness or that consciousness acts through the brain or whatever else. The mechanism just isn't there.
Well, for today, I'd just like to think of consciousness in two different ways. There are experiences of the world around us, full of sights, sounds, and smells, this multi-sensory, panoramic, 3D, fully immersive inner movie. And then
that's content of consciousness, I would argue.
Conscious self, the specific experience of being you or being me, the lead character in this inner movie, and probably the aspect of consciousness we all cling to most tightly.
Which I would say is also at least partially content of consciousness, especially when it comes to personality and beliefs, etc., because that's all secondary. When you're a baby, you have none of that. As soon as you're just born out of the womb, you don't have a concept of what it is you're experiencing. You've never been taught, you've never gathered that third-party information to tell you how to interpret these things. You have no concept of good and bad. You're just fresh. You're just a fresh consciousness. Would you argue that a newborn baby is not conscious? Perhaps you would argue that they're less conscious, which I would say is not necessarily true. I would say that, they just haven't got as many clouds in their sky yet. They haven't, had the experiences of life to generate those clouds, but the sky is still there. The framework for which experiences of life are felt through is definitely still there. And they are, I would argue, conscious. The same way that a dog is conscious, the same way that a snail is conscious. They just maybe, in that case, don't have the biological framework, the biological structures to enable those detailed experiences to be felt and saved onto whatever memory is in this case. So I would say that what Seth, is his name Seth? No, it's Anil, isn't it? What Dr. Seth. So what Anil is describing here is content of consciousness. Although I do agree that he is also including consciousness in there, which is the plain coat. That's probably not the right word. The plain screen on which that content is experienced.
Now imagine being a brain. You're locked inside a bony skull trying to figure what's out there in the world. There's no light inside the skull, there's no sound either. All you've got to go on are streams of electrical impulses which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be. So perception, figuring out what's there, has to be a process of informed guesswork in which the brain combines these sensory signals with its prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is.
Which is exactly why what he says is absolutely correct, in my view, that we are hallucinating reality. We're not seeing reality as it is. We're only seeing reality as far as our brains have evolved to be able to register and translate the information it receives. It could be that reality itself is just formless information. And as I said in one of the shorts recently, probably I don't know if I've put it up yet, the reality is very different for a human being as it would be for any other creature with a different set of hardware to interpret it. So at the core, maybe reality is simply information waiting to have some mechanism like our physical bodies to interpret it. And then consciousness comes into it and it makes everything confusing.
Now, you might have seen this illusion before, but I'd like you to think about it in a new way. If you look at those two patches, A and B, they should look to you to be very different shades of grey, right?
And just to add on to that, again, going back to kind of what he said about the brain takes in information and constructs a world based on past experiences and what we're taught, etc. So then you raise the question, again, what's the experience of a newborn baby or a creature that doesn't have that ability to kind of keep and project the world as from past experiences, etc. A lot of animals certainly do. A deer will always run from a lion. A dog will always kind of Pavlov, for example. But again, if you have a creature or a being such as a newborn baby who doesn't have those frames of references, again, can you then argue that they are not conscious as a result? Because based on how we're defining consciousness here, I would say not.
But they are, in fact, exactly the same shade. And I can illustrate this if I put up a second version of the image here.
But yes, these kind of optical illusions do show you exactly how unreliable our physical brain and our sense interpretation capabilities are of seeing the world as it is, as opposed to how we are designed to see it. And it's funny, even with that bar there, if you say look at the partial white square just to the left of the green cylinder, your brain will still say, no, they're two different colours. You can still see the two different colours even though the bar's there. At least I can. Maybe that's a me problem.
Trickery. It's the same shade of grey, but take it away again and it looks different.
Our brains are stupid. So again, I wonder what a newborn baby would see. It's impossible to know without being that baby. And of course, when they grow up, they don't have that memory. But it'd be interesting if you to give that baby that illusion to see inside of its perception and see how it sees that, whether it sees the same colour or not, because it doesn't have that framework to interpret it. Very interesting. But again, that baby, I would argue, is still conscious.
Have a listen to this. Sounded strange, right? Now listen to this.
I think Brexit is a really terrible idea.
Okay, so what's going on here is the remarkable thing is the sensory information coming into the brain hasn't changed at all. All that's changed is your brain's best guess of the causes of that sensory information, and that changes what you consciously hear.
But it doesn't change the thing behind it that's hearing it. It just changes the interpretation of the sensory input, which, quite right, is, based on the brain's best guess of what those sounds could mean based on its past and most recent experience. I would think. I'm not an expert.
In this panoramic video, we've transformed the world, which is in this case Sussex campus, into a psychedelic playground.
Someone very sensible made this and took out most of the humans and changed them with dogs. I think if we could do that in real life, it'd make the world a much better place. I'm kidding, obviously, but I do think I prefer dogs to humans.
Google's Deep Dream to simulate the effects of overly strong perceptual predictions, in this case to see dogs. And you can see this is a very strange thing. When perceptual predictions are too strong, as they are here, the result looks very much like the kinds of...
Did I see a parrot, or am I going mad? Tell me that's not a parrot.
The result looks very much like the kinds of hallucinations people might report in altered states, or perhaps even in psychosis.
Which is fair enough, because seals are canids, and that's a donkey.
If hallucination is a kind of uncontrolled perception, then perception right here and right now is also a kind of hallucination. Mm-hmm. We're all hallucinating all the time, including right now. It's just that when we agree about our hallucinations, we call that reality. Your experience of being a self, the specific experience of being you, is also a controlled hallucination generated.
Which is why it's not consciousness, it's content of consciousness. Because, again, the sense of self, who we are, our identities, are reliant on third-party information and experiences in life. I'm Darren. I'm only Darren because my mum named me Darren. Or my dad named me Darren because my mum wanted to call me Jared. But my dad insisted on Darren, so I'm only Darren because of that. I'm not Darren. I'm whatever I am. I'm a human being, but even that is a label because human beings are a concept of how to identify the certain characteristics of my body and my biology. So really, what am I? When taking all of those third party secondary kind of labels and informations and classifications out of it, I'm just part of life, which in and of itself is a classification. I'm just experience. So again, we're talking about content of consciousness versus consciousness itself.
There are in fact many different ways we experience being a self. There's the experience, and there are experiences of being a continuous and distinctive person over time, built from a rich set of memories and social interactions.
Content. I know why that little rubber hand's there. He's going to talk about the I can't remember the name of the experiment, but it's where someone puts one arm down on the table, the other arm behind their back or whatever, and then they kind of stroke the hands both at the same time with feathers or with a finger or something, and then some arsehole comes along with a hammer, goes bang down onto the rubber arm, and it makes you shit yourself, and you feel the pain in that arm. The illusory hand, the phantom hand, something like that. I can't remember, but it's a very interesting experiment, and it shows you again how your brain can be tricked into believing that this thing is part of your body to the extent that you will feel the pain. I believe that's right, that you will feel the pain in that arm even though it doesn't exist. Very interesting. But again, that to me goes to show how much of reality as it is can we really trust that it is as we see it. Because if our brains can be tricked so easily by something like that, then how can we trust that reality as we see it and as we can currently measure it is what reality is, as opposed to simply as far as we can interpret it?
Another experience which, just like all others, requires
explanation. I talked for a while there, so I've forgotten what we were talking about.
These different ways in which we experience being a self can all come apart. And what this means is the basic background experience of being a unified self is a rather fragile construction of the brain.
Bit of a step, again, because we're not talking about consciousness here as far as I would define it. We're talking about the content of consciousness, which absolutely, is, again, it can't say caused by the brain, but it is very, very closely correlated with the brain and seems to be dependent on the brain. But again, is it? Because these anomalous experiences seem to consider otherwise. Perhaps the brain is generative, but not necessary to keep it in place. If we think of it in terms of we need a PC to generate a file, but once that file is generated and we upload it to a cloud, that PC can die, and that information is still accessible by another PC or by whatever else. So if we think of it, and it's not exactly a exact parallel, but if we think about it analogously like that, then perhaps our brains are a generator, not necessarily of consciousness, but of the content of consciousness and our identities. But perhaps then once that information is generated, it is backed up to some sort of cloud system. And that's where, this evidential mediumship, etc., can come through, and these near-death experiences where we see past deceased relatives that we knew, etc., because their information and the information that the medium is receiving is there in, some would call it the Akashic records, whatever the mechanism is, who knows, but that would then make sense because that medium is then downloading the file from the cloud, but that information is coming from a location that was initially received, that did initially receive information created by the brain. If that makes sense, probably not, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Our experience, which, just like all others, requires explanation.
I've done it again. Let me go back a bit.
So let's return to the bodily self. How does the brain generate the experience of being a body and of having a body?
Again, the wrong question. Again, it should be does first rather than how does.
Well, just the same principles apply. The brain makes its best guess about what is and what is not part of its body. And there's a beautiful experiment in neuroscience to illustrate this. And unlike most neuroscience experiments, this is one you can do at home. All you need is one of these and a couple of paintbrushes. And the idea is that the congruence between seeing touch and feeling touch on an object that looks like a hand and is roughly where a hand should be is enough evidence for the brain to make its best guess that the fake hand is in fact part of the body. Experiences of the body from the inside are very different from experiences of the world around us. When I look around me, the world seems full of objects, tables, chairs.
In one way, absolutely, but in another way, every experience is from within us. It's just that they're caused by stimuli externally rather than internally. I mean, the only way we can ever experience anything externally is through the way it interacts with our bodies, and at that point it becomes internal signals and internal, if something's hot, then you're not feeling the object, you're feeling your body's reaction to that object being hot. And so, really, the properties of that object are nothing more than your body's abilities to interpret the properties of that object as far as it's been designed or evolved to, just different words that I mean for the same thing. So again, every experience is an experience within ourselves of internal body perceptions.
Perception of the internal state of the body isn't about figuring out what's there, it's about control and regulation, keeping the physiological variables within the tight bounds that are compatible with survival.
It's because that's how we've evolved to be. We've evolved purely from day one to survive in the best way possible for our surroundings. That's why there are so many different species that change based on where they are, because there are different areas of the earth have different environmental conditions, and so different animals that have developed certain features to survive those. The whole purpose of evolution is to develop and become better suited to the environment that we live in, and human beings just develop this certain way. So, of course, our interpretation of the world as it is largely is to ensure our survival, or to try and survive as best as we possibly can. That's why I have an anxiety disorder, because for some reason my genes have developed in a way that, is hyper aware of everything that could potentially be a threat. It's just the way that it is. And maybe in the future we'll all have something similar, because a lot more threats are developing in the world, societally and mentally as well. So, absolutely, I think the way that our brains have evolved to experience the world is, for a large part, based on survival. As Dr. Donald Hoffman says, we've evolved not to see the world or to see reality as it is, but to see reality in the way that's the most useful for our survival.
So our experiences of the world around us and ourselves within it, well, they're kinds of controlled hallucinations that have been shaped over millions of years of evolution to keep us alive in worlds full of danger and opportunity. We predict ourselves into existence.
That I struggle with, because in order to exist, in order to predict anything, we need to exist. So we can't predict ourselves into existence. But again, this is semantics. I know what he's talking about, and I would just say that's not consciousness, that's our experience of the world, the content of consciousness. Consciousness at its base is the thing that already exists before we do that predicting, because something needs to be there to predict in order to create a prediction. So again, it's that this isn't a video on consciousness and how consciousness comes to be. It's a video on why we see and experience the world the way we do and how we interpret things, which is fair enough, but it certainly doesn't, I don't think, warrant the immediate conclusion that our brains obviously generate consciousness, because that's not what's addressed here. But what is addressed is how brain states correlate to, how we experience the content of consciousness. So a very different question. So I think this is another conflation on consciousness versus content of consciousness. Maybe it was never intended to talk about consciousness, but it's Anil Seth and he's a consciousness researcher, so I assumed it was.
Now, I'll leave you with 3 implications of all this. First, just as we can misperceive the world, we can misperceive ourselves when the mechanisms of prediction go wrong. Understanding this opens many new opportunities in psychiatry and neurology, because we can finally get at the mechanisms rather than just treating the symptoms in conditions like depression and schizophrenia.
We can't get to the mechanisms if we can't assume that the brain produces consciousness alone, because again, correlations do not really entail causation. We have no mechanism at all as to how non-conscious matter can give rise to consciousness. We have no mechanism as to how consciousness could exist without a physical brain. We just have the correlations that could go, in my opinion, through both possible explanations. So it's just a question of, where does the evidence point most? Does it point more to a brain generating consciousness explanation, or a brain separate from consciousness, or some other kind of more monistic idea? And to that, we have to look at things like anomalous experiences of consciousness that seem to defy the brain generation models, and say that, well, at least to me, there's more evidence to suggest that it's more than simply the brain generates consciousness, which in and of itself is not simple, because we don't know how that would be at all. But the evidence to me just seems to point to an alternative explanation.
Our own individual inner universe, our way of being conscious, is just one possible way of being conscious.
Just one possible way of interpreting the content of consciousness.
And even human consciousness generally, it's just a tiny region in a vast space of possible consciousnesses. Our
possible experiences within consciousness.
Individual selves and worlds are unique to each of us, but they're all grounded in biological mechanisms shared with many other living creatures.
They're all correlated to biological mechanisms or biological states and biological changes. Not necessarily generative, because again, it could be that these kind of act as pathways through which something, who knows what, passes through and therefore experiences as a result of the changes in the brain function, brain state, rather than being ultimately generative. It's more interpretational, if that makes sense.
When the end of consciousness comes,
again, we're applying traits to consciousness that we don't know if we can apply. We don't know if consciousness can end or not. If it's a fundamental part of the universe, then maybe it cannot end, because ending implies time, and many experiences of consciousness are reported as being outside of time. So in which case, consciousness does not end. But again, here, this video isn't about consciousness itself, it's talking about the content of consciousness. But again, there's anomalous information reception from people who have passed away, accurate anomalous information reception, that seems to suggest that that being or that identification and memories of that lifetime are still there somewhere, and in which case has not ended. But again, that's content, that's not consciousness itself, the sense of being aware of things.
There's nothing to be afraid of. Nothing at all. Thank you.
So in my opinion, that was a very, very good talk indeed about how we perceive our reality as human beings. However, this to me rang more as a video on, as I said earlier, content of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. Consciousness itself being, in my view, the blank screen of awareness in which the content appears. So simply that state of being aware. That most basic part of you which sits behind all of your thoughts and emotions and sensations, which simply has those experiences. That's what I consider consciousness, whereas everything else, as Dr. Seth described here regarding perception, is the content which happens within it, rather than consciousness itself. And I would certainly agree with Dr. Seth that our brains are necessary in order to experience life the way that we experience it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what reality actually is. It is only reality as far as our brains are able to compute it, I suppose. Although it is certainly a lot more than a simple computer. And as he clearly demonstrated by the optical illusion that he showed and the phantom fake hand, whatever it was, illusion, we are certainly very subject to being fooled into believing something is real when it isn't necessarily, or at least perceive it in a way that is contrary to how it actually is. And I'd go back to the argument that in that case we can't really know at all what reality actually is, because we only have the hardware to determine reality into a certain perception for us. And that's when the hypotheses come in that, well, maybe reality is just information that's being received by various receivers in different ways, depending on their level of evolution and what level of sophistication, the tools they have, i.e. their brains and sense organs, to translate that information into a perceived reality. So thank you very much indeed for watching. I'm going to try and post a lot more of these member-only videos to the channel, just to give you some incentive to continue supporting the channel, because at the moment I know I've been very lapsed on doing them because so many other things have come up, but I'm going to try and get back to doing these a lot more frequently now. So thank you all very much indeed for helping support my project, and I'll see you all in the next one.